Good evening. Thank you for coming tonight. This is a special evening of entertainment, toe-tapping music. I'm Charles Maynard. I'm a pastor at Cokesbury United Methodist Church, and I'm going to be with you tonight as we go through this great music. We're thankful for Second Presbyterian hosting us tonight, and I also want to point out that this is a benefit for Second Harvest. And so on your way out, if you will put something in the baskets as we have them at the exits, remind you that you can write checks to Second Harvest or First Presbyterian Oak Ridge. I just want to say that the need is great. We have people, children, adults, all kinds of people that go hungry, and Second Harvest is one of the great ways that they make ends meet and get the proper food. Second Harvest distributes food and resources to over 560 partners. And that's like food pantries, shelters, churches. I work at a church that has a great relationship with Second Harvest. And the work that we do with Second Harvest multiplies out into the community. Every dollar that's donated, 3 meals are provided. So that's what we're about tonight, is having great music, a few little stories, and to help Second Harvest. We're going to enjoy a very important aspect of Appalachian life tonight, and that is music. Music and stories. My first assignment as a pastor was on Lookout Mountain down below Chattanooga, Tennessee, a Cumberland Plateau kind of community, the southern part of Appalachia. I was in a community named Plumnelly, because it was in the northwest corner of Georgia. If you went west, you were in Alabama. If you went north, you were in Tennessee. So it was called Plumnelly because it was Plum out of Tennessee and Nelly out of Georgia. And we lived at Plumnelly for 6 wonderful years. The shock of that mountain community for us, the first Sunday that my wife and I were there, was the singing. We had an entire congregation that sang in 4-part harmony. They had no choir because they couldn't agree on who the director would be, because they could all do it. They were all that talented in this community. The entire congregation sang that way. And so music was at the center of the life of that community, especially on Sunday morning and Sunday evening and Wednesday evening at the church, and on Saturday night at the community center. I don't know if you know enough about Appalachian culture to know what a community center is. A community center is the old school before consolidation. That's what a community center is. And so at the old school, we had square dances, we had concerts, we had music every Saturday night. And so that was a part of that community's life. This evening, we're going to hear music that's been a part of this region's history. We're going to enjoy music inspired by the rich traditions of the Appalachians. You're going to hear songs that you know by heart. My Hope is Built, Angel Band, Bright Morning Stars, all songs that get sung over and over again in this part of the country. The arranger of William Bradbury composed the Solid Rock tune in 1863. And even though it's a tune from England, it's one that got co-opted here in the Appalachian, has been used over and over since the middle of the 1800s. The refrain of My Hope is Built on Nothing Less refers to the parable of the wise and the foolish builders, and builds around the metaphor of Christ as a rock with a firm basis in Scripture. Angel Band is an American gospel music song. The lyrics, a poem written in common meter, were originally titled My Latest Sun is Sinking Fast, and were written by Jefferson Haskell. The lyric was first set to music in J.W. Dademan's tune book, The Melodeon, in 1860. Bright Morning Stars, the arrangement we're using tonight, is by Sean Kirchner, who said that it was one of his favorite American folk songs. Listen to what Kirchner wrote about this. In addition to its beautiful words and gracefully arching phrases, I appreciate the song's irregularity of meter on the final phrase of each verse. There's something alive about song material that unfolds beyond the careful borders of symmetry. Kirchner said, I learned Bright Morning Stars from my college roommate during a road trip as we shared songs in turn. You know, the old-fashioned way of passing time. He said, I'd heard it before, and I made everyone in the car sing it again and again in harmony. I especially liked the way the song linked the external imagery of dawn and morning stars to the corresponding internal movements of renewal that we all experience. Day a-breaking in my soul. Years later, in the tender time following my mother's untimely death, I wrote the original setting for the chorus, soloist, and piano. He said, I made one addition to the original lyrics, which ask in turn, oh, where are our dear fathers? Oh, where are our dear mothers? The response being, they're down in the valley praying, they've gone to heaven shouting. I added a final verse in which the long-departed fathers and mothers have a chance to ask, oh, where are our dear children? And the response is, they're upon the earth a-dancing. And then he said, I like the image of those who have passed on and those who are yet present on the earth, calling to each other across eternity. All of these are a part of our rich life here in Appalachia. Let's hear them tonight. Appalachia is rich in music and in stories. My own life has been lived amid the stories of Appalachia, the stories that I heard at the supper table and fireside, that I heard on fox hunts out with the men or the quilting with the women. Appalachia stories have shaped me from my beginnings. From hearing stories about my grandparents and my aunts and my uncles to my fourth grade teacher who told us jack tales on Friday afternoon if we had been good that week. Of course, I only heard the two, but they were enough to capture my interest. I hope you know who Jack is. There's one famous one called Jack and the Beanstalk, but there are hundreds of stories about Jack that have been carried over from England, Ireland, and Scotland, and France to reside here in the mountains and pass down generation to generation. When I lived at Plumnelly, one of the privileges of being a pastor anywhere is you get to be in people's homes and you get to listen to them tell stories to you. Stories that have happened in the community. Stories that they want you to believe that have happened in the community. And it's just great to sit and listen. There was one particular woman that I would make a point to go see often because she always had a story for me. Her name was Sarah Beth. Sarah Beth once told me, I love to go to my Aunt Sarah and my Aunt Elizabeth's. So that's where I got my name, Sarah Beth, from Sarah and Elizabeth. And she said, I love to go there. They were my aunt. Well, she said they weren't my aunts. They were my great aunts. They were my grandmama's sisters. And they were smart women who knew how to raise children. Said the reason I knew that is they were always telling my mama how to raise us. And I knew they were smart because they'd never had any of their own. So they had to be smart to know all that stuff. She said, I love to go there because we ate in the dining room. That's the way she said it. The dining room. I said, the dining room. She said, law preacher, at my house, we had to sleep in every room we had except the kitchen, and we ate it in the same room we made it in. But at their house, they made it in the kitchen, and they ate it in the dining room. They had a big, huge table. They'd spread a white linen bed sheet on that thing, and they ate off of Flaherty plates that was from the other side of the world. They was from China. And they knew how clumsy children could be because they always laid out a bunch of extra forks and spoons on each side of your plate. She said that way if you dropped one on the floor, you didn't even have to reach down and pick it up. There's another one right up there next to your plate. She said me and my brothers, we'd knock them little ones on the end off just so we could use them adult ones up next to the plate. And when we was done, the same thing happened. She said we careful carried them plates into the kitchen because we was real careful, she said, because me and my brothers, we didn't know where China was. And we didn't want to have to find out if we dropped one of them things. We washed them up real good. We carried them back, careful, into the dining room and put them in a big, huge cabinet that was from China. It was called the China cabinet. We figured it must have come on the same boat with the dishes. And then, every time, it didn't matter, we pushed the table. Come on, children. They said, can you help us get to? We pushed the table out of the way. And then one of them would go down the hall and come back with a burlap bag tied with twine. Sarah Beth said the first time she remembers them untying that bag and dumping out all those cloth scraps. She said, I thought every flower in the world had been stuffed in that sack. So there's nothing but colors just all over the floor. She said, I was a little girl, I was standing knee deep in colors. And then my two old maid aunts would sit down on the floor with us and say, children, we're going to make us a quilt. And then it didn't matter who picked up the first piece of cloth. the same thing happened every time. Sister, children, look at this. This is a piece of that cloth that Mother made that petticoat for Sister Mary Margaret to wear to the ball down in Chattanooga. You remember that? She danced with that officer for Fort Oglethorpe. I still think she should have married that man. And would go on and on. Or it was a piece of cloth that had been my mama's skirt when she was a little girl like me. Or it was a piece of cloth that was from my granddaddy's shirt. My granddaddy that fought in the War of Northern Aggression. I said, you mean the Civil War? She said, there was nothing civil about that war, young man. I never said that again. She said, it didn't matter what piece of cloth we picked up. There's a story behind every single one of them. Sarah Beth says, you know, in all the years we went, I don't recollect us finishing a quilt. I don't think we finished that many squares. But, Sarah Beth said, that quilt of stories that those two old women have stitched for me has kept me warm most of the cold nights of my life. That's what we have in Appalachia. These wonderful scraps of stories, these wonderful notes that shape into music that we carry with us as we work, as we play, as we dance, as we worship. Our region was settled by British, Scottish, Irish, French in the 18th centuries, but as they came to the mountains, they brought their music with them. They brought their stories with them. One of the early traditions that they brought, the old traditions that they brought, were ballads, which are essentially stories to music, narrative tales. Some really horrible ones, by the way, but they're still amazing to sit and listen to. Sheila K. Adams, a good friend of mine from the western North Carolina mountains, learned these ballads from her granny, as she says, knee to knee. And you sang one verse and then you repeated that verse. And then you sang the next verse and you repeated the first two verses. And then you sang the third verse and you repeated the first three verses until you went through all 26 verses and got it right. Or else you started back over again and started the process. And so the elements of music in Appalachia bring so many cultures together, not just from Europe, African American cultures, as that group was added to this region, brought their own styles of music. Tonight we're going to have this piece, this bluegrass piece of the Mass. And so this artful combination of our home music put to the form of the Mass. Now, bluegrass comes from Appalachian music. Bill Monroe in the 30s began to have a different kind of music, a different style of mountain music. And that began in the late 30s, but then you added Earl Scruggs to that with his three-finger picking, and that put a whole different style to the way the music was. And so even though it had its beginnings in Bill Monroe and then Scruggs, it continues. We talk about new bluegrass and other kinds of bluegrass today. So this high, lonesome Mass takes the Appalachian sound and pairs them with a very traditional type of worship in the Mass. The essayist Lauren Isley said, if there is any miracle on this planet, it is in water. Wendell Berry, the Appalachian poet, says, the health of a region can be seen in the quality of its water. The terrain, the climate of Appalachia is wet. We have water flowing everywhere. The climate is such that water comes in and stays here and flows out to feed other parts of the country. But the streams of our region, the water of our region tells the story of our region. Listen to the names of the streams. Listen to the names of Elk Creek and Bear Creek and Duck River. Listen to the names of the Pigeon. You see? And then you hear names like Watauga and Nolichucky and Hiwassee and Ocoee and Tennessee. And then they come to names like French Broad and Holston. You see, the names tell the story, tell the history of our region, but it's all attached to water, the flowing of the water. Water marks boundaries. Sometimes it's a creek that marks a boundary between your place and mine. Sometimes it's the boundary between counties. It's sometimes the boundary between states. But water marks us in Appalachia. I think about the Civil War and what a terrible time it was for the entire country, but particularly in Appalachia. Because neighbor fought against neighbor, brother against brother, cousin against cousin. When I was at Plum Nelly, I heard a fellow who took me to a beautiful overlook. We got to this overlook, we looked off the mountain, down into the distance. And I said, what's this place called? He said, Looking Off Place. I said, yeah, this Looking Off Place, what's it called? He said, it's called the Looking Off Place. So we stood there at the Looking Off Place, and this fellow said, when I was a little boy, my granddaddy brought me here and put me right here on this rock, and we put our feet over the edge of the bluff. And he told me about the day that he'd sat there as a 6-year-old and watched the troops move through the valley and cross the river and go on up into the mountain, over it, and down into the cove. He told me all about what his granddaddy had seen and heard as a child. I looked it up. General George H. Thomas, Army of the Cumberland, marched through there, came through that area, went up over the mountain and down into the cove. Braxton Bragg from the Confederacy moved to the south, and they collided, as they often did, at a creek called Chickamauga and fought it out. This man didn't know all that history. He just knew what his granddaddy had seen and told him. But as I stood there, it dawned on me that I'm hearing a Civil War story only secondhand. It's only passed through one person to get to me. At Plum Nelly, there were divided loyalties, as there were throughout Appalachia. And there was the story of two best friends, neighbors, who'd grown up across the creek from each other. But one fought for the Stars and Stripes, and the other fought for the Bonnie Blue flag. And when they returned, both alive after the war, they wouldn't speak to each other. They still went to the one church that was in the community, but one sat on one side and one sat on the other, and they wouldn't speak to each other. Well, then, years later, as old men, a revival preacher came. And he had a week of revival services, and he laid into this church. Now, the story is that he was a Baptist preacher, and he was preaching at the Methodist church. So the story is he was trying to convert all these heathen Methodists to the true faith. But he laid into these people. And at one point, he preached to them about being cleaned up in the waters of baptism. And he took them down to the creek. And these two fellows who had fought on opposite sides, these two fellows who had not spoken to each other for decades, watched as their two sons went in and received baptism in the creek, side by side. And the story is that when they came up out of the waters of baptism, the two men walked to each other and embraced and were healed by the waters of baptism. Now, at that same revival, the preacher got to preaching later in the week about sin. And then he moved to sins and got real specific and zeroed in on moonshining. Well, the group felt like he was being unfair because they felt like he had been talking about spiritual matters and now he had moved to commerce. Because a couple of generations before this group, they had figured out that it was a lot easier to move corn and apples by the gallon than by the bushel. Yep. Well, he wound up his sermon. He got to the end, and he yelled at them. He said, if you don't stop this, you're all going to hell. And if you don't stop it, and he says, and the best way to stop it is to take all of this evil and dump it in the river. And that was the end of the sermon. The song leader, a well-known moonshiner in the area, stood up and said, and now, brothers and sisters, we will sing, Shall We Gather at the River? So, tonight, we're going to stand on Jordan's stormy banks. We're going to go down to the river to pray. But we're also going to gather at the river. Hear these songs.
Just a word from me before we sing these songs. I've never been teed up so well in my life. Such a pleasure to be here in Knoxville, and I want just to do a quick shout out to the two choral directors who made that beautiful music happen that you just heard a second ago from the three choirs that are gathered tonight. Anna and Lindsay, would you all stand? Thank you to the choral directors who put this together. eastern Tennessee and West Virginia and eastern Kentucky. My grandparents are from Harlan, Kentucky, Corbin, Kentucky. I've got relatives here tonight from Cumberland, Williamsburg, and my grandfather on my mom's side of the family was from Frog Level, Virginia. So this is really home for me, although I did most of my growing up in Middle Tennessee, and I taught at Belmont University and Rhodes College. But this part of the country is really close to me, and the music that we heard about tonight, the stories that we heard, are the stories of my life and the stories of really the songs that I've arranged and have spent a lot of my life learning and growing up singing. My grandmother read shape notes, and I sat on her lap as a child, and she was reading shape notes while I was reading round notes. We were playing the same songs, but we were playing actually totally different systems of learning. And I grew up with this material. It's very dear to me, and it's I was very, very happy to share it tonight with you all. Thank you for receiving it, and I appreciate this choir so much. Nothing honors an arranger or a conductor like someone doing their music well, and they have done that tonight. We will finish our program with this medley that you've heard, 3 river songs that indeed have wound all the way through our lives in this part of the country, and my river medley.
Hasn't it been a delightful evening? We've thanked everybody. We've thanked the First Presbyterian Choir from Oak Ridge. We've thanked the UT Concert Choir. We've thanked their directors. We've thanked these instrumentalists. We need to thank Tim. I don't know where you're from in Appalachia, but in my part of Appalachia, the day ends with the bedtime story. And several of you have headed that way already, so we'll finish the rest of them off. There was a peddler, and he went about the county with his goods on his back. And he would peddle his goods wherever he could find a customer. And sometimes a little girl would come up and say, "Have you got any hair ribbons?" And he'd say, sure. He'd pull them out of his pack and he'd lay them across her fingers, and she'd think, "Oh, if I had ribbons like these in my hair, oh, how much? And he'd say, 2 bits. And she'd start to hand them back. That's too much for her. He'd say, just keep them. They'll be lighter in your pocket than in my pack. They'll be prettier in your hair than in my old pack. Sometimes the old peddler would go home. He lived in a rundown shack outside of town. The only really nice thing about the place is it had a beautiful cherry tree behind it. And he would watch it. In the winter, the snow would lay on it, imitating the blossoms of spring. Then the spring would come, and then the cherries would follow. And the birds would come and eat them, and he'd go out and get him a handful every now and then, and people say, "Oh man, you need to make you some jam or some jelly or preserves or something." He'd say, I get by. They say, "Oh man, you can't just give stuff away to kids." He said, I get by. Sometimes a little boy would come to him, "Have you got a pocket knife?" He'd pull out a good Barlow knife and hand it to him, and the boy would think about all the things he could carve, all the mumbly peg he could play, all the things he could do with a knife like that. How much? 2 bits. He'd say, just keep it. It'll be lighter in your pocket. You'll carve better things than it being in my pack. People say, "Oh man, you can't do business that way. You can't just give stuff away." Well, you all are smart enough, you know you can't. And eventually, over the years, he gave away too much, he undersold it, and he went broke. One night, he was lying there, hadn't had anything to eat in a day or two, and he had a dream. And in that dream, an angel came and said, "Oh man, go into town, stand on the courthouse square, someone will give you a message." He woke up the next day, thought, it's a strange dream. The second night, an angel came and said, "Oh man, go into town, stand on the courthouse square, someone will give you a message." He woke up, thought, hunger's doing strange things to me. The third night, he had a dream, and an angel came and said, "Old man, go into town, stand on the courthouse square, someone will give you a message, okay?" He woke up and thought, I better go see what this is about. He put his heaviest coat on. It was the dead of winter. He trudged all the way into town. And And he stood on the courthouse square, dancing from foot to foot, trying to keep himself warm. And the day passed, and no one spoke to him. Not even, howdy. Cold, ain't it? Nothing. He thought, there's no use to go all the way back out of town to home. I can die here just as easy as I can die there. So he shuffled to an alley nearby, and just as he was about to disappear in the alley to sleep his last sleep, a fella came up behind him and said, excuse me, old man, I've been watching you out of the window of my store, and it looks like you've been waiting on somebody, but at least while I was looking, nobody came. And it's worth the price of a meal to me to know why you was standing out there. Old man said, I'd like that. So they went into the little local restaurant there off the square, and they sat and they ate a good meal. And finally the fellow pushed back and said, so, why were you out there? He said, well, I had a dream. He said, what? I had a dream, and wait. You've been standing out in the freezing cold all day because you had a dream? He said, yeah. And in the dream, he said, you are crazy as they say you are. He said, where would people be if they just went running after dreams? Well, he said, that's crazy. He said, I had a dream last night. Yeah, I had a dream last night. In my dream, an angel came to me and told me if I'd go way outside of town to an old rundown shack, I'd find a big cherry tree behind it. And if I'd dig underneath that cherry tree, I'd find treasure beyond my wildest belief. He said, where would I be if I followed a dream like that? The old man stood up and said, thank you very much. And ran all the way home, dug underneath it, and found treasure beyond his wildest belief. Which is to say, have sweet dreams tonight.